net box and a soft line.
It's all good.
Good. Professor Jordan, take one.
You know to look deep into my eyes.
Yes.
You know I'll be asking stupid questions.
You can ask me anything you want. That's fine.
But my voice cannot hear it, so someone wants to explain some of the basics. I need to ask stupid questions.
It's all good.
But I want to know is, when did you get first interested in science?
When I was young, I can tell you the year. I can tell you the context. So, 1980, 1981. My grandfather was fighting cancer. And at the same time, a young man named Terry Fox started a run across Canada called the Marathon of Hope that really captured the nation's passion. And my grandfather wasn't doing so well, and it was very impactful. And I decided I'd go into cancer research at that time. And, that's kind of what led me to this. 40 years later, hope I'm doing some good. Yeah.
What were you doing at that stage?
I was
were
in
you
primary
university or you were-
No, I was in primary school. I was 6, 7 when my grandfather and Terry Fox both died. And that kind of set me on the journey to attain good marks and do well at school. And I was lucky enough that I had some gifts that allowed me to do that. And just kind of set that goal while enjoying life. You got to have some fun. And kind of just worked at it ever since.
So, end of high school, and you managed to get the marks to go.
Yeah, I went to pre-med in Canada, Queen's University. Probably had a little too much fun my first years, but scored well on my tests and set myself up for med school. I ended up doing a graduate degree before I did med school, but that set me up well in terms of research for the future, I think. So I did cancer genetics with Professor Lois Mulligan at Queen's University, and then moved on to med school after that.
So, and you graduated as?
What time? I have a few degrees.
Well, run me through it.
I had my honors pre-med from Queen's, and then I did my master's in science, cancer genetics at Queen's as well. And then kind of did a hybrid medical degree through the University of Sydney. Spent a lot of time at Sick Kids in Toronto. Finished that off, and then started my training as a clinician. And with that, started a bit of clinical research in the background, slow but sure. And then finished off, 2012 I finished off my training and started work as a clinician, and just kept incorporating research into everything I do to get to the point I am now.
What point? Well, no, we'll move on to what point is that. I still want to know how we get from Toronto to Queen's to Sydney.
So,
And did you start working in a practice, or?
So you, as with all clinicians in this country, every country, you usually start off as the low man on the totem pole. So once you finish med school, you go into an internship. Unless you're going into general practice, that's a bit different. But I knew I wanted to specialize in pediatric oncology at that point, through some of the exposures I'd had. Originally, it was just going to be oncology as a generalist in adult world, probably. And then a friend's mom working at the Cancer Institute in Kingston at Queen's asked me to come and spend some time in the kids' clinic. Thought they were amazing at what they do and what they put up with, and kind of then focused really into pediatrics, and got really lucky. I had some great mentors along the way at Sick Kids who helped me get there. But you start off at the low totem pole. So as an intern, And you can kind of start to specialize as you talk with your mentors and your work placements around what you want to do. And so I was pretty clear I wanted to do pediatrics and I wanted to do oncology. And so I think in my second year, I had my first term, loved it. Go through the steps, become a registrar. Eventually, you take on a more focused learning and become a fellow for 2 or 3 years.
So what does that mean?
So it just means that you're focusing only on one thing. So, you're doing pediatric oncology. It's a pretty broad area, but it's really just the focus on that. You're not doing, rotations in surgery or cardiology or other things that other people are doing as their fellowship. And it's really focusing you to be a consultant down that track to eventually become a consultant in oncology training. So I did that. Actually did it across the country. So I trained oncology in Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, and then I took my first consultant job in Melbourne, where I was for about 10 years.
Okay, you still haven't explained to me how you got here, but that's...
So I did, I was the leader, eventually became the leader in clinical trials and research at the Children's Hospital in Melbourne, including neuro-oncology, which is my subspecialty. And eventually, with the development of proton technology that they wanted to open up here in Adelaide, they needed a neuro-oncologist. And so I was recruited into Adelaide to lead kind of the medical integration side of those kinds of things between the Women's and Children's and the New Bragg Centre.
You've had a few catalysts then. You've had marathon across Canada. And by Queen's University, you're talking Manhattan. You're talking Queen's.
No, Queen's University is in Kingston, Canada.
Well, that's where I got confused because that's where I thought, but there's a Kingston also.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a Queen's and a Kingston in New York, so I'm like, which one does he mean?
Yeah.
So somehow you got from... There's two things that you really... I found moving, actually. You said you were triggered by some of your patients when you first went into pediatrics.
Yeah.
And if you don't mind, I'd like to explore that a little bit more.
Sure.
Just tell me what happened.
Sure. So one of my colleagues that I was doing pre-med with, her mother actually ran the volunteer clinic for the kids. And all I did was, she said, I said to her, I'm not sure I can do this. I wasn't quite sure how I would handle, kids being sick and kids with cancer. And she said, you'll be perfect. You'll be perfect. And so I said, okay, I'll come down and I'll give it one try. And so I went down. Being a graduate student, you have a bit of flex on what you're doing. And I arranged with my boss that I would go down once a week to do this and tried it out. And sure enough, you see these kids who they come in, they're happy, they're playing. They might have to then go through a procedure, and seeing the people work with them to go through it, whether it's getting a port accessed or I remember a young man who I'm still in touch with actually, having a bone marrow or, needing to get his treatment hooked up and feeling sick, and just how he deals with that and how the staff deal with it. It just really drives home that, it's a special type of medicine. It's very different. You form relationships more because, it's not just the child or the patient, quote unquote, the patient. It's the child, the siblings, the parents, the grandparents, and you develop relationships with the families, which is different, I find, than most medicine. It's very patient-focused, of course, in adult medicine. And so it really drew me to those relationships. And I find that you work hard for that. Not that people don't work hard in other areas of medicine, but I find that our community probably goes that extra mile to be available, to spend time, to help these families and the kids.
Well, if you've got any empathy, it must be when you do pediatrics and cancer. I thought it would be very challenging. Personally, I think I'm worried that much. You must see some hard things. That must be emotionally difficult.
Yeah. People, people often ask, or they'll say, I don't know how you do what you do, and I always say the same thing. Well, I don't know how a mechanic does what he does because it's a specialty, and you learn and you train and you get used to it. You have bad days, you have good days, you have great days, and so you just learn to deal with that, like any other career, ups and downs. And the training is different. We are trained to deal with difficult situations. Is it easy? No, it's not easy, but we are trained to do it. And over time, you do get used to it. You cope with it, I guess is a good way to say it.
Okay, so what was the pull of research? And I think you've explained that, but if you want to compress that again, I can see what the pull is. But
Yeah.
if you want to put it in your own words, and how do you start researching and making a jump from clinician to research, and what was the attraction?
So I think my background in having done my graduate studies, I was fairly entrenched and understood kind of the background of it. The step to doing clinical research was good mentorship. I've been very, very fortunate to be exposed to people who are fantastic teachers, fantastic leaders, people who give and want young people to have opportunities in this world. And because of the faith that they had in me, I was able to step up and do things. And so the big thing is finding time. A lot of young people, and I hate to say this because I'm going to sound like an old curmudgeon. I think that in medicine now there is a push for less pressure, to focus on a holistic kind of care of yourself as a clinician and your patients. And a lot of that has to do with time and time management and an appreciation that we shouldn't be flogging people. The way I got to where I was is I flogged myself. People didn't flog me. I made myself available, and I wanted to push myself so I would be available and around to do things. And so if somebody asked me to do something, I did it. And if that meant that I had to come in early or go home late, that I did those things. I do think that's falling a little bit by the wayside because we are so keen on focusing on everybody's quote unquote holistic care of ourselves, which is important, but I think it needs to be balanced. And I think we probably have pushed one way too much than the other. And I am concerned about research into the future, and particularly clinical research because of that. But that's how I did it, was sacrifice my time and my family's time. My wife would agree with that, but she's been very, very supportive. And without my family support, that never would have happened.
Well, you'll be pleased to know 22 interviews, 16 of the professors we've interviewed have said exactly the same thing. So don't worry about being a curmudgeon. You're going, oh no, shit, we don't know where this is going. This is not good. But we're not even dwelling on that. But yeah, it takes commitment, it takes time, it takes money, it takes energy.
Yep.
Which brings me to the nature of research. Before we go into your specialty, which you'll have to explain to me because it's a new field. I mean, and I'm saying a new field because I'm 65.
Yeah.
So it's over 20 years ago is yesterday to me.
Yeah.
I'm sure that you're younger and more attractive than I am.
I don't know about that.
Where would you like to start with that journey?
In terms of research? Yeah. So I guess it really, in terms of my clinical research, it probably really took off with one of my mentors, Professor Guittardo from Western Australia. Nick had just freshly gotten back from St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. He was looking to get his own career really. He's a few years ahead of me, but really wanting to get it jumped off in terms of his own work. He had just established a new research lab with another colleague, Raylene Endersby, out in Perth, and I joined the team as a senior trainee, and just I had said to Nick, if you have any projects, anything you need done from a clinical aspect, just let me know. And within the first week, he said, "Oh, I came across this funny thing with a patient. Then it happened again, and I thought maybe this is something we could write up." And so I went through the data for these patients, went through the literature, and prepared a manuscript and gave it to him in 3 days, 3 days. It was on his desk. And he kind of...
So what was the funny thing?
It was a child who'd had a drug rash. We have to take medicines that are developed for adults, and how we use them is often different than in adults because of dosing and toxicities and other things. And what we had found was that children dosed with kind of the predicted doses, there was probably more toxicities based on age and how they were processing the drugs. And so we basically put together basically a series of drug levels and toxicity pictures around time. And for lack of a better word, not refuted, but added to the literature around the drug toxicity for this medicine. And put this manuscript together fairly quickly. And I think Nick kind of looked at it and went, "Oh my God, what have I got myself into?" And we actually, from Woe to Go, that was published within a few weeks. It wasn't long, 3 or 4 weeks it was published. And from that point, Nick just kept giving me little projects and little projects and little projects, and giving me opportunities to do different things. And then when I left Nick, I got to the Royal Children's in Melbourne, and the team was going through a bit of a transition phase, some retirements, sort of some young people coming in, and real opportunities in terms of taking a step forward in both research and leadership. And I worked very, very hard. Initially, when I came out, finished my fellowship, I started off doing everything in pediatric cancer. I did leukemia, I did lymphoma, I did transplant medicine, I did solid tumors, I did brain tumors. I actually worked across all the teams. Why? Because I was the new guy and I wanted to learn on the job, making decisions. With that, you start to see little things, and you pick up on differences in treatment. I'd been at other centers. The Royal Children's was doing things differently than I was used to, and so I started asking questions. And with asking questions comes research. Okay, what have these patients been doing? How have kids been behaving? Are they doing as well as other centers? Are they doing better with different treatment approaches? And so I started accruing a patient database. There was a patient database, but a particular pulling out patients with brain tumors and asking some of those questions for myself. And started to put together some interesting findings that I then had I offered to a young person to do the same as I did in the past, to help me out with these questions and these problems. And that young person did a Master's of Clinical Science, is now a head of department in another center. I think he did 7 papers coming out of that research, 6 or 7 papers out of that research. And so it just really kind of kick-started me on that track. And shortly thereafter, the leadership at the Children's offered me to start looking after clinical trials. Next thing I knew, I was building the clinical trials unit, finding new people to run trials. I got frustrated because we couldn't open more, and working more with industry and pharma around new drugs for children. As you get more and more experience, they actually come to you and they ask you how to develop things, and how we do things, and so I was able to help with some of the fairly major breakthroughs with glioma in children.
Right, well, there's a lot happening
Yeah,
here.
yeah, we've done a few
Major
things.
breakthroughs we're going to talk about. What is cancer we're going to talk about. Before we go into your particular skill with brain cancer. And also, I guess, want to explore that it must be difficult with children and adolescents because their bodies go transforming all the time. So it's the different balances and imbalances within the body, which is not adult.
Yeah,
I don't know what order to put this in.
yeah.
So if you can help with that, that'd make me look great.
Yeah, look, the considerations we have with children are very different than in adults. Adolescents have their own kettle of fish, if you will, that you have to consider in terms of, those changes that young people are going through to become adults in terms of responsibilities and some of the dynamics about negotiating treatment and what they will accept and not accept. It can be some interesting conversations. But children, by and large, they just do as they're told. Where in adults, it can be very difficult. You tell an adult, you've got liver cancer, you need to stop drinking. You have stomach cancer, you have throat cancer, you need to stop your smoking. Lifestyle changes you really need to do, and all these things that can help. It can be very difficult to change that as a GP, as an oncologist, whoever it is you work in adult medicine. Adults, for lack of a better word, are fixed, and they're hard to change. And so it can be more difficult for me, I found it more difficult to deal with adults in terms of what we'd like to do, negotiating those treatments. Whereas in children and families, they really just want the best for their child, and they'll do whatever they can to do that. And so you can put together a treatment plan. The children tolerate chemotherapy a lot better than adults, and so we can do what we need to do easier, for lack of a better word. But the spectrum of problems that they have are different, and so we have to consider growth and development of children, which is a major problem in brain tumor research, more so than in adults. It's becoming more of a problem, appreciation of brain fog and lifestyle issues that happen post-treatment. But for children, it's the fundamental problem we have is the growth and developmental issues that our treatments bestow on families and the long-term late effects that our survivors have from those treatments.
I have sort of heard that.
Sorry, Sid.
Yeah.
Just stop it there.
Sure. Marketplace.
Professor Jordan, take 2.
Nicely marked. So it's in nice and luck. Oh wow! Okay, that was. I know where I was going, which was like in pituitary glands and everything that changes in an ever-changing body.
Yep.
And certainly, I've heard from other pediatricians that there's certain points that if you solve the cancer with a kid, it won't come back because the body's
Yes.
moved on. So that's
Yeah.
in general terms.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Do you want to start with the broad? What is cancer? Because it's going to come up a lot.
So,
And we've got a lot of technical stuff.
I always keep it more simple than that. It's an abnormal growth. And you have abnormal growths that are normal, and then you have abnormal growths that are completely abnormal. And cancer is the abnormal part. That if it continues, it's allowed to continue. Basically, it will harm and kill the person who has it. It's no different in children. What's different in children is that where in adults it tends to be a lifetime of exposures that typically cause cancers, whether it's sun, alcohol, smoking, whatever it is, industrial exposures that causes those cancers through changes in cells. In children, it's not. In children, almost universally, it's either development gone astray, which is the vast majority of our tumors, or in a growing percentage of patients, genetic predisposition. So something inborn in the patient, inherited from their families that causes the cancers. And both are fascinating in terms of moving cancer forward in terms of research, because I think that as we learn more and more about children's cancer and children's brain tumors, I think understanding the developmental pathways may give us treatment options. And then also understanding the genetic predispositions, which seemingly are growing by the day. We find new genes all the time that never were thought to be implicated in cancer that now are. And I actually predict that over time we may move closer to 40 or 50% of children's cancer actually being something that they're inherited, that predisposed and drove them towards getting cancer. It's probably sitting around 15 to 20% now, but with our ongoing research, I think that will expand. But it really gives us and affords us opportunities for cancer prevention and also treatment into the future, I think, as we learn more and more through research.
I hope so. You were saying, well, that's what your gut's saying is 40, 50%, but you just got to prove it. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we are proving it. It's, it used to be thought that it was less than 10%. Research here in Australia on our large case series of high-risk cancers proved it's probably somewhere between 15 and 20. And literally with, ongoing changes with how we do research, how we do diagnostics of children, comparing against their germline, we're finding new genes that are implicated in cancer all the time. And that's why I say, because it's going up incrementally with every kind of year to two as new studies come out, I do think over time, as we expand out what we think of as cancer genes, we will find more and more and more that are actually there, that are underlying the cause of cancer for children with time.
Do you think it's definitive that you'll run out of up at one stage, that'll be it, you've got it all?
I think over time we will. There's a long way to go. I just think back, over the years, we had I'm thinking of one of the childhood cancers, medulloblastoma. We had a fairly set group of genes that we thought caused those cancers. And it was only a small percentage. And then colleagues in Germany kind of expanded out what they were looking at in terms of those cancer genes and found a gene called ELP1, which is implicated in 40 to 50% of those medulloblastomas, in particular in young children, that had never been seen before. It was always there, but it hadn't been explored further. It wasn't included in kind of cancer predisposition. And then they found it. It was there, and we now know that it's the causative gene in a large number of those infants who get cancer. I think that premise of non-cancer genes, whether it's neurodevelopmental, whether it's inflammation, whatever it is, as we expand out what we're looking at and our cohorts internationally grow in terms of those patients who have matched genomes from their tumors and their own genetic makeup. And we accrue more and more and more of them for these rare diseases, we will find these commonalities and links, like we did in medulloblastoma.
I mean, if you've got to say, look, post-World War II, pre-World War II, research into cancer, and what we knew, how much?
Look, not much. First World War, they made jumps off and found some of our chemos. It was gas attacks that we found out that, you could manipulate those chemicals, and you could design something that ablates bone marrow. And that's where leukemia treatments basically started. And, taking those incremental jumps from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it took until the 80s to really start to see impacts on leukemia, for example, in children. And now, 45, 50 years later, we've got some groups of childhood leukemia who are basically cured. We know that it can be a long journey for them, but there are subgroups that the outlook is outstanding when you diagnose them, and it's really comforting to know that you can say to a family, in all likelihood, this will be difficult, but we should be able to cure your child. We're not there with brain tumors. I kind of liken to where we are right now with brain tumors to where we were in the 80s and 90s with leukemia.
Well, you better explain what
So in the 80s and 90s, we started to understand more the biology of leukemia. We understood the genetics more. We understood the lineage changes that lead to different leukemias. We started to understand minimal residual disease. We could track out these leukemia variants, and we could track them over time and show that we needed to drop them to different levels to kind of push kids into remission and cure them. And those technologies really pushed leukemia treatments forward so that we're at where we are now. 85 to 90% of all children with leukemia are cured, and some of them are, as I said, near 100%.
What were the breakthroughs?
So the key breakthroughs were understanding the genetics, and then the other thing would be the introduction of minimal residual disease. Actually, being able to so it's being able to track leukemia cells in the body to a very, very, very low level. So we know that if you, over time, you start your treatment and you're not dropping that level, those kids are at very high risk, and so you need to amplify their treatment through a transplant or other things. And those kind of little tricks, for lack of a better word, to follow disease allowed leukemia specialists to push those cure rates even higher. In brain cancer, we have not had the tools to do those things. Whether it was the genomics, we really didn't have that step forward until recently. And minimal residual disease, both of them are starting to become more in favor. In flavor, I should say. So, for example, really, when you're dealing with really rare diseases, it's difficult to make and understand the disease. Any one site around the world, even with our big centers, you might not have enough tissue to actually do research. And so you need to pool those resources. And really, in the mid to late 2000s, several key groups started to make impacts. I always go back to medulloblastoma because it kind of kicked off the era that we're in now in terms of cancer genomics and brain cancer. And St. Jude Hospital for Sick Children in Canada, DKFZ in Germany, Boston Children's, these large centers had started to pool samples from around the world and their own cohorts, and with the new technologies available, started to understand that the diseases we had thought of as one disease were in fact multiple diseases. So medulloblastoma, we had appreciated down the microscope that they look, subtly different between a few different subtypes, and they seem to have some different clinical outcomes. And in fact, when you started to apply advanced genomics, whether it was sequencing or transcriptomics or whichever technique you want to do, methylomics, that's my interest, you could see that these diseases were in fact different. And so medulloblastoma became 4 main subgroups, of which there are now 14 different subgroups of those diseases, each of which is driven by subtly different genomics or epigenomics. So the drivers for the cancer are different for each of those diseases. And you can imagine if you're treating them the same, they might not have the same outcome because the drivers are different. And so what you can now do, and what we've started to do, is tailor make the treatments based on risk, targeting certain molecules if we can to improve outcomes, so that we improve outcomes in general. And our first international study run by St. Jude Children's Hospital, I was a part of it in Melbourne. We're going to run them here in Adelaide, the next generation. Prospectively started to make those changes. So for example, there's a subgroup we call WNT. It's run through a developmental pathway called WNT. And we knew, based on research from many people, that those kids do fantastic. So with standard chemo surgery, good surgery, chemo and radiation, the outcomes for most of those young people are well over 95%. So the next prospective study we did actually looked to limit treatment. We dropped some of the drug doses and we dropped the radiation dose. And they seem to be doing just as well. It's not yet published, but it's been presented internationally, so I'm able to share that. And so the next iteration will probably build on that as well. Can we safely drop something else from the treatment regimen? Why is that important? Well, when you're using surgery, you're using chemotherapy, and you're using radiation, it's not just about curing the child, it's the harm that you do when you do it. And we need to be thinking about that constantly in how we're designing therapies. And so we know that in kids you get radiation to the brain, the whole brain, or larger components of it, that they're at gross risk of poor outcomes long term. And I'm not talking about survival, I'm talking about survivorship. So how they live into the future. So young people who get irradiated as young, particularly very young, they don't do as well. So about 60% of young people treated for brain tumors with radiation do not reach functional independence as adults. So they don't carry on relationships, they don't work, they're not taxpayers. They're really reliant on public services and family to care for them. And that to me is exceptionally sad. That you work hard to cure these children, but then you see some of the side effects that they're left with for life. And so anything we can do at the upfront setting to limit radiation, to alter chemotherapy so that it's less harmful, whatever those things are, we need to be considering as we move forward. And it's only through understanding the biology of the disease that we're starting to be able to do that. And that's really the era we're in. I really liken it to the 80s and 90s, where we made this amazing step forward in cures for children with leukemia. And now we've got this other big group of kids with brain tumors that we now understand the biology of most of the diseases. We're now working to find different therapy options for all of those, whether it's different modes of radiation like proton versus photon versus this new thing called flash, or it's understanding the immune environment and utilizing our own immune systems to find out why cancers evaded it and how we can trick it back into responding better, whether it's through different immune modulators or checkpoint inhibitors, which have failed in children so far, but can we manipulate that more? Or the new thing, CAR T therapy, so chimeric antigen receptor T cell therapies, that is kind of the fad and everybody's really interested in because there seem to be some responses.
T cells aren't that new though, are they?
They're not new, but manipulating them genetically to do what you want them to do is relatively new. Particularly, it's now a forefront of therapy, B-cell leukemia. And in adults, they've been trying and manipulating, different variants to do different solid tumors and other liquid cancers. And in children, we've started to make that step. We have one trial open in Australia. CAR T is made here in Adelaide, but the trial's actually being run in Sydney through a colleague, David Ziegler, where we're starting to put those manipulated T cells back into children to treat really awful brain cancers where we don't have a lot of treatment options. So I really do liken the kind of where we're at with childhood brain cancer to where we were in the 80s and 90s with childhood leukemia. I think we're about to make a real step forward.
That's exciting.
I think so. That's why I got into this field. I kind of saw it coming.
Have you had any breakthroughs in your life? Is it even a minor one where you go, shit, this is good?
Yeah, so I've been really lucky. Again, when I was at the Children's Hospital in Melbourne, I got offered to take on the phase 1/2 of a new drug that was out in the adult world treating melanoma and other adult cancers. targeting a very particular molecular change called BRAF. And that one was a mutation in the BRAF gene that we see in childhood brain tumors, both high-grade and low-grade glioma. And so I ran that phase 1/2 study, and the company came back around and said, we want to run a larger phase 2/3. Can you help us out? Can you give us some suggestions? And I contributed to that. And what it led to was basically proving, after a couple of studies, that using those targeted molecules is better than chemotherapy, markedly better. And that has resulted in those two drugs being approved for the indication of glioma in children. Probably I don't want to say it's going to be the most impactful thing I do in my career, but it might be, was contributing to that work. And then another molecule, kind of the second generation of those drugs, was developed and got involved in those studies, helped design those studies. And that drug is now approved for relapsed and refractory glioma and is being tested as we speak upfront versus standard chemotherapy. Because we think that those molecules might be even better than the first generation in terms of outlook for children. But they were the first 3 drugs approved for children with brain cancer in a long time. And that's really, as someone who does clinical research, runs trials, and really is just globally trying to make things better for kids and families, I think has been makes me happy that we're making those steps. I wish we could do it faster. Children with cancer, they're rare diseases by nature, and getting industry and pharma excited over children's cancer is difficult. They have to answer to shareholders, and the drive to bring drugs to children is not as strong. And so a lot of our research is reliant on government and philanthropy, with some pharma at the back end, if you can prove that the market will be big enough, or there might be an indication in adults or something similar, to try and make those next steps. But it's exciting times. It is exciting times.
Since you brought up philanthropy, I better go out and don't say ACRF, say the Australian Cancer Research Foundation. What the Romans have, what's the ACRF ever done for you?
So I'm really excited by what the Australian Cancer Research Foundation is going to allow us to do, actually. I haven't had a lot of exposure to them personally until recently, where we've been awarded a grant. With the Bragg Center hopefully opening in the next couple of years, we think there's a real opportunity to ask a lot of questions about survivorship. So how young people survive their cancers and understanding the side effects of the radiation we give them to do it. I think there is fundamental biological differences. It's not just the fields that proton radiation allow us to get, which are much tighter and limits the amount of brain tissue that normally is exposed to radiation, which is a good thing, which is why we want to do it. We will be doing it in Australia. But beyond that, I think there's some biologic differences. So how you respond, and I think each patient is biologically in tune to respond to that radiation subtly different. No one understands it though. And so we had, with my campus colleagues working in cancer research, we had approached the ACRF to support some ancillary equipment to start to understand and ask questions about proton radiation versus photon radiation versus this other new mode called flash. We want to be able to track cancers and in our animal models and different models better. And so we've put forward for a new imaging facility here on campus, which will be state of the art, and it will be only possible through the Australian Cancer Research Foundation's contribution to that. And that's really, I think, really exciting for the campus and for Australia, to be able to, the way we've designed the facility, you'll actually, researchers from around the country, if they have a particular question, can bring their animals here, irradiate them with the proton facility. They'll have to check in and check out, and it's got to be well managed in terms of access to the beam because it's expensive. But they'll be able to do their experiments in-house because we've redesigned how we can help them do that and how we can do it on campus here. And that's really exciting because nobody else can do it. There is no other facility, or, probably for a good decade, probably won't be another facility in Australia.
High risk, high reward, because you're saying we don't know. We don't know what we're going to find because that's the nature of research.
No, there's a lot of, indicators that this is true, but nobody's proven exactly why. Two children with exactly the same cancer, treated exactly the same way, have grossly neurodevelopmental differences. A child irradiated at age 4, same patient, same treatment, same doses of radiation. Why can one have a preserved IQ and another one becomes disabled? Nobody can answer that question. And that's some of the research we want to do, is understand those fundamental differences. What happens to patient A versus patient B over a population, which is what we will collect here in Australia, is a population-based data set around outcomes and survivorship.
So you have to play like for like. We can't.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. How a 10-year-old responds to radiation is different than how a 4-year-old responds. And so you do need to understand those basic differences. Most 10 to 12-year-olds will have their IQ preserved. What they will have changes in is attention, memory, processing speeds, those types of things. Whereas the child at 3 to 4 will have all those effects, plus their IQ will drop.
It's not surprising, I suppose. There's so much development to come, and you're zapping it with something quite heavy.
Correct.
And there are new areas. There's new areas, talking to some of them, especially with imaging and also radiation, where they're going very specific and not touching the healthy tissue, but really getting straight into the...
Yeah, and that's what the proton facility will do. The idea behind proton, basically the physics, instead of having a follow through the cancer, so you target the cancer, but the way photons work is it actually keeps traveling through and then drops its dose as it goes through. With proton, you can actually drop the dose in the tumor, and so you preserve those normal tissues around it. And we know from longer term late effect studies that it does seem kids who get proton typically have better neurocognitive outcomes. So we now know that's happening, which is why it's so important we get this service up and running.
Yeah. It's not a collider, describe the machine you're building.
Oh God, don't get me involved in getting into physics. I leave that to the physicists and the team who are putting the machines in. But it's essentially, for lack of a better word, it's a machine that speeds up protons, and those protons get whipped out and targeted to the tumors. That's the way I kind of equate it to. It's my simple understanding of the physics. Yeah.
The future, you said it's looking pretty right, but it's a bit like, I grew up in a very optimistic time with the space program and everything else.
Yep.
Gee whiz, the stuff that came out of the research there, from microwave ovens to coating on lenses to everything that was not expected to come out of that research, but it's like suddenly.
Yep.
And that's the essence of really true good research, isn't
Yep.
it? It's
Yeah.
like you don't know what you're going to get, and therefore, is there such a thing as failure?
Yeah, you look back at the history of cancer research, in the 70s, people were talking about using viruses to manipulate them and use them for cancer therapy. Well, guess what's happening now? People are wanting to use oncolytic viruses to try and treat cancers and manipulate them to do, manipulating viruses to program CAR T cells and all these different things that are happening. I do think some of the changes that are going to happen in the next 50 years in terms of cancer, it's going to be dramatic. I think we're going to better understand how to harness the immune system. And if we can do that, if we can harness the immune system better through tricking it, adding different modulators to allow the immune system to get in better than it currently can in brain tumors, for example, then we will make incremental steps to improve things. Where we might be able to drop radiation doses, we might be able to alter chemotherapy programs so that those survivors we get, which hopefully will keep increasing, also we can then drop those number of patients who are stuck with the problems that we've given them from their treatments, so that we get more taxpayers, we get more parents in terms of our survivors of brain cancer, that they live normal lives working in whatever they want to do, and they're not limited by what we've done to them to cure them. I do think we'll get there.
That's a great answer. It's been fun. I'm going to ask Steve who's getting these questions because he normally does. Stevie? But when you answer, look at me. But,
Yeah. You mentioned some certain treatments that you're very interested in. Like, did you say methyl something? Did you mention 3 different?
The methylome.
And they were for sorry, I've forgotten the term. But,
So in terms of diagnostics. Yeah. So yeah, I can answer that. Yeah. So I think the big step forward for us in getting to the point we are now in understanding the diseases was through the genomics of the cancers, the translation of those genomics, but then also what we call the epigenomics of the cancer. A lot of pediatric brain cancers actually run through the epigenome. What the epigenome is kind of, I liken it to, if you have 1 million words in a book, it can be a bit tough to read if you don't have punctuation. The epigenome is kind of those punctuation. It's turning genes on and off to paint a picture. And a lot of pediatric cancers are actually caused by genetic changes in epigenomic hardware. What that allowed us to do using some of those epigenetic changes is it was kind of a first step off to better diagnoses. And so we can actually take the epigenome and we can mark off in the genome different molecular changes that turn genes on and off, and we can read those. It was originally about 400,000 points. It's now over 800,000 points that we can take from the genome. We can fire that into a computer, and we can actually get a readout that says this tumor is this class. And what that allows us to do is when you look down a microscope, things can look very similar. But you can't tease out very subtle differences in terms of what that disease is. And so a Wnt medulloblastoma looks like a group 3 medulloblastoma. But the outcome of this Wnt tumor is 100%, and in a MYC tumor, it might be 60%. And so these kids need really aggressive treatment, and these don't. By putting it through these classifiers now, it's an adjunct to what the pathologist can use to help make that better diagnosis. And what it drove was the WHO and the pathologists who write the textbooks to actually have to change their diagnoses into an integrated diagnosis. So now we have a diagnosis of disease, but also the subgroup and the molecular drivers for those diseases. I was really lucky. I got exposed to the team that started to develop this for the world. And has the biggest experience with it. And through that, we actually have brought it here to Australia as a NATA accredited test that is now run through the VCGS in Melbourne. So any pathologist from around the country now can order that test to help them make a diagnosis better for their patients. That holism of an integrated diagnosis, I think, really is the first step to improving outcomes. We've been static in terms of brain tumor outcomes for about 30 years. We've had no major improvements in survival across all of the really malignant diseases. And by understanding now what those diseases are, and we'll find this out over the next 5 years to 10 years, I'm actually waiting on some follow-up from that work to prove that the outcomes are better. It's trending that way, but our final data set's not done. we will start to make incremental changes because we're now diagnosing the kids better. We're understanding why they have the disease they have, and we can then modify their treatments better to the patient rather than to the disease as we knew it previously. A really fundamental step for cancer research.
You know, I've tried a few people. Do you want to have a crack at explaining genomics or genome?
It's a very
simple without being overly dumb.
It's a very generic term to basically describe the pattern of your genes. So all the A, C, G's, and T's, which is what makes up your DNA. Genomics is essentially the output from all of those genes that tell us about what your cancer is and who you are. That's genomics.
That's fantastic. I'm really happy. Very good. Anything you want to say?
Not really.
I'm, no,
I'm
Did we discuss submarines at one stage?
Well, I can tell you my submarine story, which is basically I think they should cut one or two from the budget to better pay for research in Australia. If the government got rid of one or two submarines from the AUKUS agreement and put it into the NH and MRC budget or a future fund like the MRFF and dedicated that money to those things, can you imagine the things we could do?
No, I can't. But I mean, I remember Nixon saying we'll put a man on the moon and let's cure cancer, and we'll do that in a decade. Good luck with that, Dick. But
Yeah.
But we're getting a lot closer than we were.
I think we are because of the steps and the incremental steps we have. And I do think that this holistic appreciation of what the tumor is, its impact on the individual, it really will have real fundamental steps forward. And if we can get governments to understand that, you know, children with cancer is rare. It is something that no government official is ever going to say, we can't fund this because the public won't like it. We'll lose votes. You're never going to do that. And if they just realized that if they stepped up and paid for clinical trials as a standard of care to allow us to bring more trials in, more drugs in, more companies in, it actually drives the amount of money that comes into the health sector. If you fund basic research, for every dollar you put in, there is a calculation that you get $1, I think it's $2, $2.50 back. If you put that money in to childhood research and cancer research, you will only have better outcomes in 20, 25 years. If you think about it, over a 5-year period, there is about 1,000, 1,200, 1,300 kids with brain tumors, just brain tumors. If we can turn 60% of them not being functional independent adults down to 20%, you've increased your taxpayer significance dramatically from a group of kids that would have otherwise been reliant on public services and the goodwill of families. Why not make that investment? It will only get you benefits into the future. But what do I know?
Been pitching the government lately, have you? That's
Look,
very well published, well polished.
you know, I'm the first to admit it. I through my role here in Adelaide in particular and nationally through our ANZCHOC body, I am very well aware of government and government funding and the decision making they make. And I get that it's difficult. But as I said, no one's going to be upset about childhood cancer. No one is going to be upset about childhood cancer. And I just find it really difficult that I'm going to say this, and it might not be a popular thing, but politicians are concerned about their next vote and getting their next election. Why? Because at the end of the days, they want the pension. They want to continue to be paid. They only have to put in whatever it is, 10 years, 15 years. I can't remember what it is nowadays in Australia. That's their goal. Honestly, to me, that's their goal. It's not the betterment of society. And that's sad to me. It is sad to me why we're concerned about that many submarines when you can probably get by with one or two less, and you can make real impacts in global research in this country if monies were put into better things. But what do I know? I'm just a simple oncologist.
Very good. Yeah, happy? I think you pleased you got that off your chest. That's good.
Oh, look, I say it all the time. I'll say it to anybody who listens. I've said it to the health minister. Federal, you can't get it. You can't get a meeting with the federal, but the state politicians I have. The shadow minister has met with hasn't met with me, but has met with colleagues. Yeah, yeah. Which is interesting because the former health minister was very, very receptive to the brain cancer mission, and he kicked it off. Greg Hunt. It was actually one of my families that started all of that. They went to the media, and next thing I know, I'm getting a phone call from Minister Hunt's office. Please explain, which I did, and it really kicked off a lot of funding for brain cancer research, which is good.
How much of your work is now trying to get grants as opposed to being able to come at the
A lot,
phase?
a lot more. That was the plan when I came to Adelaide. And they asked me to do some extra things, which I'm slowly building. Like we've got a small lab group and other things, which takes grant time. And my recruitment was not lab group; it was me. And so now I'm building up, slowly trying to build up a lab group to answer. Actually, we're focusing on survivorship, not treatment and things like that.
So how's Adelaide? For Canuck, you've covered most of Australia. Do you go back to Toronto much? Or?
Yeah, I've got my family's still there, so I'm back regularly.
Do you find Adelaide?
I love it. Half an hour to the best wine fields in the world, in my impression, anyways. I'm sure the French and the Italian might say different.
Oh, they know.
But no, I love Adelaide. I love the beaches here. I love the weather.
There's more wet sharks.
I love the food. Yeah, and when you look like I do, you tend not to go surfing. I've said it all along. First time I go surfing, I'm the one that will look like a seal, and I will be eaten. So I have decided not to surf.
Because they cut the weak ones out of the pack, don't they?
That's right.